All right, hello and welcome everyone. This is the third session in our Safe Systems Summer Learning Series presented by the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety, or CSCRS. My name is Kristen Brookshire and I'm a research associate at the Highway Safety Research Center where CSCRS is housed. I'll give you all a quick orientation and then I will turn things over to our moderator for today, Dr. Noreen Mcdonald. So CSCRS was established in 2016 as one of the 5 national university transportation research centers funded by the FAST Act. We are a consortium of research partners from 5 universities: UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, Florida Atlantic University, UC Berkeley, and University of Tennessee, Knoxville, with many of our students and researchers participating in or helping to moderate this series. If you're not yet familiar with CSCRS, our consortium recognizes that transportation challenges are increasingly complex and interconnected, and that this demands new skills and approaches to problem solving. We bring together expertise in engineering, planning, robotics and data science, public health, and other fields to develop new ways to approach our most enduring and complex safety issues. So 2 years ago, our consortium held its first conference, the Safe Systems Summit, and it was organized around systems-oriented approaches to addressing transportation safety challenges. We introduced concepts around safe systems and system science, which can be used to explore assumptions and interactions. And in the summer learning series that you all are here for today, we continue to host a space to share ideas and questions around these concepts and to reflect upon the ways in which we as a research and practice community can both appreciate the complexity of the transportation system while continuing to foster shared goals and identify innovative new ways to address safety issues. So in the third session of this series last Friday, our panelists talked about authentic engagement and co-creating safe places. A key theme was that engagement should be genuine and relationship-based, not transactional, and we heard plenty of examples of opportunities for this type of engagement from the perspective of the private sector, community organizing, and local government. And they also talked about who's allowed to define the safety problem in their community. And that certainly echoed the first session in our series that explored the questions of safety for whom and when and where. And I remember we had a question in the chat about how all of this talk about community engagement related to safe systems. And I can imagine that person probably was thinking of high-tech vehicles and innovative infrastructure. But looking back to the slide on the screen, relationships are very important. The human element is very important. And so if you missed that discussion, I encourage you to go back and look at the recording from last week. So for today, I want to, and all the previous sessions are online already too. So for today, I want to remind everyone that our session is being recorded and it will be posted online, and that we have 2 methods for engaging with each other and the panelists during this session. So we are hoping that you'll use the Q&A box if you have a question that you'd like the panelists to reflect upon. That will make sure that our moderator sees that question separate from the rest of the chat. And you can also use the Q&A box to upvote a question that's already been asked. And just keep in mind that the chat defaults to panelists only for most people. So make sure you switch it to everyone so that other attendees have a chance to see and respond if you're sharing a resource or a comment or a reaction to something that you're hearing. And if you would like to tweet any of your takeaways from today, you can use the hashtag CSCRSLearning. And so with that, I will pass the mic to our moderator for today, Dr. Noreen Mcdonald. She's an associate director for CSCRS in another UTC, the Southeastern Transportation Research, Innovation, Education, and Development Center, more commonly referred to as STRIDE. And at UNC Chapel Hill, she is the chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning and holds the Thomas Willis Lambeth Distinguished Chair in Public Policy. Her research is at the intersection of planning and public health, and currently she's studying how changes in transport and technology and policy impact road safety and access to healthcare. And previous work has focused on how infrastructure, such as schools, roads, and bike lanes, impact road safety and physical activity, especially for children and young adults. Noreen?
Great, thank you so much, Kristen, and welcome to everybody for our wonderful session today. I'm so excited that these speakers can join us and that you are able to join us as well. Today's session is going to tackle the possibility for network level approaches to managing kinetic energy in our transport system with the goal of improving road safety. Many of you on today's webinar are already familiar with perhaps what we might call more piecemeal engineering treatments that are used to manage speed at specific locations. In this session, our goal is really to push the conversation forward. We're lucky enough to have three of the leading thinkers in the field that are going to help us think through what some of the opportunities are to move beyond hotspot analysis and instead implement more systematic approaches to think about broadening this toolbox that we have for kinetic energy management. So we're going to start the session today with a little bit of a reminder to all of us about why we focus on kinetic energy in these discussions of road safety. And then we'll be able to hear from each of the three speakers, Ofer Grembek, Chris Cherry, and Rebecca Sanders, as they walk us through what they see as the most promising or innovative approaches for network level thinking here. We're going to hear about very different domains and very different approaches, from thinking about roadway design, vehicle design, the planning of the very communities that we live in, what the policies are, and how the federal, state, and local levels come together to shape our communities through policy. So we're really going to sort of move the conversation up a little bit, I think, to hear both about exciting initiatives that different places are trying, and also to think about how we can even move the needle a little bit more on these network level approaches. So I'll go ahead and introduce the speakers in a second, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the format that we'll be using today. Each of the speakers, each of the panelists will present, let us know what they're thinking about, what they're really excited about, that they're seeing in practice and from their own work. And then we'll have an opportunity for lots of conversation on these topics. So as Kristen mentioned earlier, if there's a topic or a question that you would like asked, please use the Q&A button in Zoom. But we really also hope there'll be a rich interchange among all the people that are participating in today's webinar through the chat function. Likely panelists won't be able to monitor that chat, but it's a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation, share resources, and we will certainly go back and look at it afterwards. So let me start by introducing our speakers. Dr. Rebecca Sanders is the founder and principal investigator of SafeTREC Research and Consulting. She has 15 years experience spanning the academic and private sectors, including research on bicyclist and driver design preferences, national pedestrian safety trends, and e-scooter user behavior, as well as national guidance for bicycle facility design and roadway reallocation. She has also worked with cities and counties across the country to address multimodal safety through Vision Zero and systemic safety efforts. Dr. Sanders currently chairs TRB's Bicycle Transportation Committee and serves on the City of Portland's Pedestrian Advisory Committee. Dr. Ofer Grembek is a researcher and lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley. He is co-director of the university's Safe Transportation Research and Education Center, which many of you may know by its acronym SafeTREC, a research center that's affiliated both with the School of Public Health and the Institute of Transport Studies at Berkeley. Dr. Grembek has studied pedestrian and bicycle safety issues and safety management. His research expertise includes injury risk in multimodal environments, pedestrian safety, and safe systems, along with systemic approaches to road safety management. Dr. Chris Cherry is a professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of Tennessee, and we can see his beautiful view of the mountains there in his background. And his primary research focus revolves around safety, sustainability, and travel behavior, particularly for emerging transportation technologies or non-motorized road users. Much of his career has focused on micromobility and their impacts on the transportation system. He co-directs the Light Electric Vehicle Education and Research Institute and also co-chairs the TRB Committee on Emerging Vehicles for Low-Speed Transportation. So I hope that gives you just a sense of the really interesting set of panelists that we have for today's talk. I'm super excited to hear about the different domains that each of them will lay out, and then to really engage in a dialogue with the panelists and with the questions that you develop, so that we can see how some of these, what's most promising, what needs to be put in place to move forward on some of these issues. So our speaker order today is we're going to start with Offer Grembek and then transition to Chris Cherry, and then Rebecca Sanders will be the last panelist to speak, and before we move into the question and answer portion. So I will go ahead right now and turn it over to Offer, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Noreen, and thank you, CSCRS, for organizing this learning series. I've logged into several, and it's really, really interesting, valuable, and most importantly, timely. In my kind of preliminary remarks, I always like to start with talking about the fundamental goal of the transportation system, which is to provide mobility. But there is a relationship between this overarching goal to provide mobility and a set of evolving constraints under which this goal must be delivered. In other words, we're striving to provide mobility under a set of constraints which include efficient, cost-effective, equitable, sustainable, and of course, safe mobility. Over the past few years and through the work of CSCRS, there have been important efforts to redefine what we mean by safe mobility. To a large extent, this is driven by a moral imperative to prevent these preventable deaths. Most of these efforts fall under the wide umbrella of the Safe System approach and Vision Zero, which are essentially policy innovations to move the needle from our currently unsafe system to a safe system on which no one can be severely or fatally injured on. To achieve this, the Safe System approach identifies 5 elements, which are the pillars of our system and include safe roads, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safer users, and of course, post-crash care. The Safe System approach also identifies 6 principles, which tell us how these elements need to be fused together to create a safe system. There are motivational principles, operational principles, and 2 very important focal principles, which are at the center of today's discussion. Both focal principles are very human-centric and to some extent reflect the limitations or the limits of people. The first one is that humans make mistakes. This does not mean that humans are careless or negligible, but that at some point we are going to be late or emotional or tired, and we are going to misjudge a situation. The second focal principle is that humans' bodies are vulnerable. This means that the human body cannot sustain the amount of kinetic energy or impact that are commonly carried along our transportation system. So combining the large amount of kinetic energy with the fact that things can go wrong creates a reality of a high-risk domain which mistakes can and will be catastrophic. We also have evidence that there are unbalanced safety consequences in our system. Different modes carry very different amounts of kinetic energy and also provide different levels of protection. So for example, if a pedestrian misjudges a situation and gets hit by a fast-moving car, the pedestrian can die. If a driver misjudges a situation and hits a pedestrian, again, the pedestrian can die. So the burden of an unsafe system is also unbalanced, and it's something that we need to keep in the front of our mind all the time. Now, with the risk of sounding a bit like a high school physics teacher, I want to remind us that kinetic energy is related to the mass of the moving entity and the square of its velocity or speed. So even small increases in speed produce or can produce major increases in the risk of energy and the risk of injury. And this is why speed is such a critical part of traffic safety. It is a very important factor since it determines the amount of protection that we need to provide when something does go wrong. The protection to surviving kinetic energy can be achieved by a triangular safety net that at its first level includes safer speeds, safer vehicles, and safer roads. And Chris is going to be talking a little bit about that, but also a peripheral level that includes land use and other planning considerations, which Rebecca will also talk about a little bit. So how does this guide us to identifying policy options at the network level for our toolbox? We currently do a lot of work to track crashes. We do this at the spot, at the corridor, at the systemic level. And safety work cannot be done without tracking crashes, since it does give us evidence of places where the network must be improved. However, this is what we call a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Crash-driven policies is something that we must do, but it's not enough to get us to this to a safe system. If we want to get to a safe system, it is necessary to compare the systematically compare the protective capability of the system with the amount of protection that is needed. In our case, the need is best approximated by the kinetic energy that is carried on the network. To do this, we need to quantify the average and peak levels of kinetic energy on the network, and in parallel, we need to know how to effectively tap into the protective opportunity of the system, which Noreen mentioned, that all these different layers and domains, what I call the pillars, so it can control or contain the amount of kinetic energy. We're actually wrapping up a CSCRS study that demonstrates how this can be done. Other policy opportunities include setting speed limits using a safe system approach framework. This means that speeds are set such that when something does go wrong, it will not expose someone to unsurvivable impacts. For example, roads with many vulnerable road users must be operated at speeds of 20 miles per hour or less. And we're currently also doing a study for Caltrans to develop such a framework that the type of users provides a guideline to what the speed limits should be. And lastly, there are intersection models such as the kinetic energy management model, which is the basis for FHWA's safe system for intersection framework, which is basically a way of using kinetic energy to develop better intersection design. And I believe HSRC researchers partnered on this effort. So to summarize, we should continue to track severe crashes and study how they can be prevented, but we need to more explicitly develop ways to align the amount of kinetic energy that is carried along the network with the protective capability of the system. This amount of kinetic energy to which people can be exposed without sustaining serious injury should be the basic road and vehicle design parameter. And I look forward to having a very fruitful discussion with the rest of you.
Thanks, Ofer. Go ahead, Noreen.
Oh, no, I was just going to go ahead and turn it over. Thanks so much, Ofer. Particularly, as we said, we'd start with setting the stage about reminding ourselves about why kinetic energy matters so much. And I think Ofer's really made that sort of first and foremost in all of our minds as we continue into this conversation. So thanks for doing that. Chris, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Yeah, so thanks for the physics lesson, Ofer. I don't have to say that now, but essentially, yes, mass and velocity, those are the two elements that really matter. And if you think about the one that really matters to the squared power, it's velocity. And so when we think about how we approached roadway design, that dictates velocity, and vehicle design in the past decades, we haven't had this intrinsic kind of kinetic energy framework to think about those things. And we're still using a lot of our same road design frameworks that we developed in the 1960s, our same design standards and the like across all institutions from the federal level down to local governments. And one of the big challenges, I think, when we think about a systematic approach to road safety is changing the paradigm in which we think about safe transportation systems. If you look at high injury networks that are published all in most cities or many cities, I won't say most, but many cities in the Vision Zero framework, you'll see just through visual inspection that the high injury networks follow these linear corridors that are not random. It's not a random smattering of high injuries and fatalities. It's intersections and arterials, and most often intersections on arterials. And the problem with that, of course, as we all know now, is that arterials try to balance this essentially this devil's bargain with mobility and safety. And you end up with a situation where people with certain value systems have to find a link between those two. And we try to quantify those value systems and make them objective. But at the end of the day, we value high speeds and high mobility. And I look forward to Rebecca's discussion on land use and how we manage that later on. But what are the highest kinetic energy modes of transportation that exist? Freight trains. Those are really high kinetic energy, right? They're pretty safe. Why? Because they manage the conflict so well. Interstate highway systems have extremely high kinetic energy. They're probably less safe than freight trains, but they manage conflict well. And I think the big challenge, of course, is how we mix conflict zones in these high kinetic areas. And what the engineering approach has been to standardize designs, to, you might say, over-design the system, assuming that the human is not going to make any mistakes. And what this results in is traffic signal, these are highly operated environments. Add extra turn lanes, add extra signal phases. All of these highly operated environments are aimed to manage high kinetic energy conflict, and they work perfectly so long as the human or maybe some future automated computer never makes a mistake. And we know that's not going to happen. So how do we solve this systematically? I think that we talk about roundabouts in the kind of discussion of this as an example of a spot treatment for a high kinetic energy system management. And roundabouts are proven to reduce crashes at those points, but how do you systematically improve that conflict? Some state DOTs have made roundabouts essentially a default. Most state DOTs and traffic engineers and transportation designers don't think of roundabouts first for an intersection design. It's something that comes later. And so design standards play a huge role. And I think that introducing design policies is one way we can start to dig ourselves out of this hole that we've created over decades. I say this to every state DOT person that will listen. We're still building roadways that are going to create problems for us for decades to come from a safety perspective by design. And we need to break that mold. We need to break those standards basically and come up with lower mobility, lower speed systems that maybe still provide good levels of access to our land uses. The other side quickly is vehicle size. Vehicle size does matter, but it matters in my mind, and I think the evidence will show that it matters less than speed. And the bigger SUVs, bigger trucks is part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. We can manage large vehicles on our transportation system, and we manage them by making them go slowly. Public transit buses are large, high kinetic energy vehicles if they're going fast. Light rail trains, streetcars are high kinetic energy vehicles if they're going fast, but they're generally safe when they're going slow, right? And so how do we manage that? And then the last point I want to make is when we create high kinetic energy systems, we create a monoculture of occupant protection, redundancy that excludes almost every other kind of vehicle except a car. And you create fragmented networks where I can ride my bicycle, for example, in my subdivision, in my neighborhood, but I can't ride it beyond that because I have to get onto one of these high kinetic energy systems. You can say the same for neighborhood electric vehicles or any of these micromobility vehicles. And you start to see the fragmentation when you're looking at like no ride zones on scooters, for example, that basically reduce the mobility of every other user besides the car. So with that, I will turn to the harder challenge that, as they say, the only good transportation policy is a land use policy. And so over to Noreen, I guess.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think you've given us some really interesting food for thought about how in particular, the roadway design matters. And I think that's a very natural lead into what Rebecca will start us thinking on maybe more explicitly in bringing in some of the dimensions around the land use conversation and the planning conversation. So Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Offer and Chris and Noreen. I'm happy to be here. So yes, as Chris quipped, the best transportation policy is land use policy. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about in preparing for this and just sort of bigger picture is, as Chris mentioned, we know the dangerous roadways in our cities. I have personally created a lot of those high injury networks, and we could point to the roads that would be on the high injury network before we actually did the actual sliding window analysis that it took to develop the high injury network, right? It's very consistent, and lots of research is coming out reinforcing this. We know these are dangerous, and yet we're stuck with them, right, in some ways. And so I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is why we have them. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, there's sort of two components to why they exist. Chris mentioned the sort of like operational part of this is there's sort of that there's trying to be the blend of a place where you have mobility and safety. I think we all know how that balance has worked out. It's tended toward mobility over safety, particularly for those outside of a car. But I think one of the things that we don't do well when we're talking about safety is acknowledge that these roadways that are really disproportionately dangerous for pedestrians and bicyclists are still dangerous for drivers. So they're just, they're not good roadways from a safety perspective, really for anyone. But thinking about why they exist, and then therefore, what we might be able to do to start to mitigate the challenges of having arterials is, looking at actually really taking a step back and looking at things like our land use policy in terms of, how we've allowed, commercial development in certain areas, or we've tried to incentivize, tax base. And so we have allowed things to expand well beyond where it might make sense because cities are relying on commercial tax base from big box stores, for example. But another key aspect of this is actually our housing policy. And I think that's something that we don't talk about in safety enough, that the federal government has had a very large hand in subsidizing single family zoning for a long time, single family housing for a long time, for decades. And that comes through the mortgage tax deduction, but it also comes through things like the actions to prop up Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae in the 2008 subprime housing crisis. And I'm not going to be on record here as saying that I want to get rid of either of those things. As a homeowner, it would hurt. And also, it's just complicated. I think it's politically infeasible. But what I will go on record as saying is that there are other countries in the world that do this better than we do, and we can learn from them. So we don't actually have to say we're going to get rid of the mortgage tax deduction. What we could say is, as a federal government, with the resources to do this, we're going to incentivize other types of housing. So you have places, other countries, particularly in Scandinavia, for example, where they have public housing that actually, is apartments or condo based and is able to be purchased. So we have a real attachment to home ownership in this country, but it doesn't have to be in the way that we've seen it for decades. And when you do that, and when you have the federal government involved in that way, it's sort of increasing the supply side, which is not something that we've done in decades past as well. It is something actually that Biden's been talking about in the current infrastructure bill and in the other legislation that he's considering or has proposed. And so when we have those corridors, or we have rather the other types of housing that get as much priority, if you will, from federal support as single family housing, we just give people additional options, and we reduce the pressure to move out, to drive till you qualify, if you will. And that then reduces the pressure on those arterials. If we were to think about just taking the system as it is today and just saying, as a blanket policy, you can't have any roadway within a city that's above 25 miles an hour, I think we all know that would not be politically feasible. And it's because the demand is too high. But when we address the demand by making other options more feasible and or at least as attractive, then we start to get to a place where we actually can modify those roadways in a way that really does directly address the kinetic energy part. that's dealing with the bigger picture housing policy part and land use policy part. And I'm sure you all have thoughts on that. And I look forward to discussing that further. Another aspect of this that I want to hit on really quickly is that when we reduce the demand for, multi-lane high-speed arterials by addressing that, we also create the capacity to repurpose those roadways and to invest in other types of transportation. And that's another way to address this kinetic energy challenge. We don't have people who feel desperate to keep their commute to a maximum of 45 minutes, and therefore they have to have the roadway be, X number of lanes to accommodate X volumes at X speeds. We actually create this capacity for other modes, like a very serious investment in transit. And so we can have people shifting to other modes. Transit, I think also Chris has talked about micromobility. I think what we're seeing now with e-bikes, really expanding people's range and expanding what they can do on a bike, carrying passengers, carrying goods, going, using less energy to get from place to place so you can make more trips on that bike. We just create the ability for someone to make a different choice. And in so doing, when we sort of justify the reallocation of the road space, if you will, into these other modes, and that in and of itself addresses the kinetic energy. Chris mentioned that we have buses that are actually high kinetic energy vehicles, but we manage them by managing their speed. But we have a lot of other vehicles that are quite a bit lower, right? Like an e-bike, not that it can't do any damage, because it definitely can, but just in general, the mass is so much less, and we do already control speed on those vehicles. So there are ways that we can use our land use and transportation policy together from sort of a bigger picture in a more of a carrot approach to try to incentivize things, and really being successful in that, and thinking about the way that our federal government directs money to certain pots right now, and thinking about how we can actually redirect some of that money to incentivize other modes, other options for living that then precipitate a demand for other options for transportation, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there. Yeah, I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to our discussing more with questions. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks to all of our panelists for sharing their thoughts about what are some of the opportunities really for network level thinking. And I think also introducing the complexity that brings in. I think if you sort of put together what we just heard, it ranged from thinking about vehicle design, roadway design, the specifics of intersection design, and as Offer was getting at, the policies that sort of oversee that at a macro level, to some of the topics that Rebecca brought up around federal housing policy, going all the way to thinking about issues like fiscal zoning and what our municipal finance structure is. So I think the fascinating part of this conversation is it lets us tie in many different topics, right? It forces us to recognize those sort of complex feedback that exists between our housing policy, our municipal finance, our transportation system, and road safety. So we're going to go now to the question and answer. So we've had a nice set of chats going in as people introduce themselves in the chat box. As a question comes up, please do use that Q&A button in there right now to ask any questions that you'd like me to put forth to our panelists. I want to start us by thinking about this sort of very complex environment that I think all of our panelists addressed in their opening remarks, and that's the high-speed arterial, right? It's often sort of where the rubber meets the road in a lot of our conversations about what we should do in our own communities or what policies should be. I think Chris didn't quite use the term Faustian bargain, but devil's bargain maybe was what he termed it. But thinking about this complex balance between mobility and safety. And one question I have is, obviously many places face this. If we look at countries with better safety records than the US, they also have a need for high-speed mobility on arterial networks along with low-speed mobility. They also have suburban areas, as many of our communities do. So I'm wondering if some of our panelists could address this high-speed arterial road safety question explicitly by helping us think through how other countries or other examples even within the United States that they think are promising, how they have addressed this complicated environment. And so could I toss the ball to anyone first?
I'll jump in, Noreen. And I welcome Offer and Chris to jump in too. I think one of the things that has been done better in at least some places is the idea of separation in time and space. So you're right, you do have these higher speed roads in these other areas. I remember when I did an internship in Copenhagen in 2007, and I was next to a road that was probably the highest. It was a ring road. It's the highest speed road in the area, and I was on a 10 to 12 foot separated cycle track, and so I was far. There was a buffer for me and the cars. There was a physical curb, and I felt really safe in a way that I just would not feel in the United States, because we don't provide that kind of facility, right? So if you think about, what we want to do when we have the higher speeds, we want to, and this, I will say, I feel like this maybe is a little bit contrary to what we were seeing with roundabouts. So Chris, I'm interested to hear your perspective, but what we've theoretically done with signals in this country is separate users in time. We haven't necessarily separated users in space, right? But what has tended to happen with signals is that I think they are overused, and also people don't always, they don't always obey the signals. So I think we could get into that. But in this situation, we were next to each other, so we weren't necessarily separated in time, but we were certainly separated in space in a way that allowed both of us to go at the speed at which we needed to go and feel safe and comfortable doing so. And the pedestrians were then further inside. I think, you mentioned that these places still have suburban areas, and they do. One of the key differences that I've noticed in my studies of other places and travels in other places is that still their suburban areas look somewhat different from our suburban areas. And because you have, sort of the such an incorporation of multiple modes in the system. So you have robust transit systems, you have robust bicycle networks in many of these places, not all of them, of course. Then when you get out into the suburbs, those modes it's not as if they are foreign. So people do still bike in the suburbs, and they do still take transit occasionally in the suburbs, because it's something that they do in their everyday life when they're, in another part of maybe the more urban part of the area. Whereas it seems to me that in the United States, because we haven't actually done that very well, really almost anywhere. I mean, I think I could name a few places that have done it better than others. Often those are college towns, which tend to be a little bit more of a unique environment, right? We don't have the mindset for it, and then we definitely don't have the infrastructure for it in the suburbs. And that's a lot of it, is just providing that infrastructure so that people have the opportunity for it to use it, number one, and number two, so that it actually is in someone's mind that it should be expected. That visual cue of the roadway is so powerful, and I think we really we sometimes defy sort of the expectations of human behavior in transportation, where we expect people to behave a way and ignoring the fact that we're giving them a bunch of psychological cues to behave in another way. I don't know, Chris, Offer, I don't know what you have to say about that, what your thoughts are.
I can add a little bit. Thank you, Rebecca, and I really like how you described the kind of the environmental cues that we give people and how that is part of the problem. But I also want to take a step back and maybe challenge this trade-off that we're talking about in terms of mobility versus safety, for two reasons. One, I'm not sure if, or to some extent, that trade-off has been a cornerstone of thinking about safety for a while, and as all of us described, didn't quite get us to where we wanted. And the second thing, I think that kind of as a society, we have our moral values and moral imperatives, and these can be used as constraints to providing mobility. At the end of the day, we do want to provide mobility, but we want to provide it subject to constraints. If we're talking about safety, the gradually agreed upon standard would be 0 fatalities. So we want to provide the best mobility we can, subject to the design and all of the rest of the conditions, so that if something does go wrong, it will not cost someone's life. In addition to that, we have sustainability constraints and equity constraints, and all of these need to be fused in and agreed upon by the policymakers. I believe there's a congressional resolution that now is starting to make statements about 0 fatalities. And then from that, we'll be able to start building a system that would provide the best mobility, subject to what we are saying in terms of safety. So going back to the question about the high-speed arterials, I think a lot of one way to address it is to specify what is the level of protection, or what is the safety standard that we're willing to accept for an arterial that's multimodal and much more complex to manage than, as Chris described, freight trains or highways. What is the safety standard that we want to design it and plan it to? And then from that would define the best mobility that we can deliver, given those circumstances. And to some extent, kinetic energy and the people's ability to sustain impact can be a starting point for thinking about these things. And that's kind of where the safe system approach can help us better set speed limits for high-speed arterials.
So you two have said just about everything that needs to be said, I think, on this topic, but I do think that it is impossible to have 45, 50 mile per hour arterials where there's right angle conflicts, essentially. And when we think about protective features of an intersection, for example, we have to slow vehicles down into those intersections if we want it to be let's just be really modest about our expectations. How about a vision zero intersection? I say this to my students: the intersection you design, will somebody die there over the life of the intersection? And that, from that perspective, I think it's nearly impossible to have the kind of protective features where no one will make a mistake and misjudge whether it's a transit user walking across this roadway or whatever else. On the flip side, there's so much low-hanging fruit, I think you might say, that is our incremental improvements in our federal design standards have allowed us to do things like maybe systematically build narrower lanes on our arterials that give those visual cues that you might say a conservative engineer can now stand behind federal allowance to build narrower lanes. I always say 10 foot is the new 12 foot, there's something like that. So the idea that we're making some progress there, I think, is good. I don't know if it's fast enough, but it has something as modest as that change has allowed people to build road diet type projects or retrofit projects more easily, more straightforward, less design exceptions and the like. And I think that that's helpful. I think we have in many urban cores, we have the great streets that anybody can point to. And if you look at those streets, most of the streets that you might call great streets, Alan Jacobs Styles great streets, are designed, you wouldn't be able to build those streets today because of our design, so-called our design standards. And a lot of those standards are built on essentially a house of cards, on long ago 1 or 2 papers that showed something, right? And so how do we get back to that point where we can build those streets anew, or we can convert back our arterials and still provide mobility? And the panelists, we've talked about this. How do you have polycentric type development where you have high mobility between the islands, but then you have maybe high accessibility and low speeds within the islands. So I don't know what the right answer is to that. But certainly what we're doing now is maybe the wrong answer. Okay.
If I could, Noreen, if I could jump back in really quickly, because I think this is such an important discussion, because as Offer was talking, and I really appreciate you bringing in, Offer, the policy perspective on what's happening, I am unfortunately a little cynical about behavior change right now. I think, I wish I weren't, but I am. And at the same time, I am inspired by things that are visionary and bold. And I feel like that is where, like, that's what we need. We need the bold vision for people to have something to rally behind. So if we think about the idea of loss being stronger than gain, that's a pretty proven behavioral economics concept, right? And so one of the challenges, kind of going back to what I was saying in the very beginning, is, you know, thinking about the demand for arterials, what do we do about the fact that until we have other commensurate changes, that demand is going to feel, because the demand exists, anything that's taken away from that is going to feel like a loss, and people are more resistant to loss than they are to gain, right? And so how do we balance that? And I think, you know, over time, maybe we can do some work with cultural behavioral shift, but that's hard. And this is, to go back to the cues that the environment gives us, really ingrained in American culture. The car is it's such a part of our culture, right? But one of the things that I find inspiring there is the use of pilots to try to actually give people a sort of safe way to see what something looks like without the full commitment. They haven't fully committed to the loss, so that part is mitigated, and yet they get to experience the gain. So if we think back to all of that amazing work that Jeanette Sadiq-Khan and her team did in New York, and how in the beginning people thought they were crazy for closing part of Times Square, right? Or closing some of the roadways and creating pedestrian plazas. And then I saw a headline the other day that said, you know, remember when we thought this was crazy? And now if you tried to undo it, people would revolt in a huge way. So that I think that the use of pilots is something that we should promote to try to actually test some of these concepts. So I talked earlier about, you know, investing in a transit network. And, you know, Chris, you just talked about like lowering, or rather narrowing lane width. So what do you do with that excess capacity that you had on the roadway? Sometimes people use it to provide bike lanes, right? But there are other things that we've seen, especially in the middle of the pandemic, that can be really valuable, like outside seating or just greenery, you know, things that make walking more pleasant because people actually have needed to be outside so much more. And I would really like to see our profession be bolder in that way through trying things so that people can get a sense of what they can gain, and then the loss can feel less painful. And I think that is really complementary, or complements the policy ideas. But I think it actually is a necessary part of actually getting those policies passed in some ways, is to give people not just the vision of no one else will die, because unfortunately I don't think Americans feel that. Most of us probably don't know someone close to us who died in a car crash, because unfortunately those crashes tend to be disproportionately disadvantaged people. And so there are people in those communities that might know many people, but on this call and among this panel, I don't know anyone, for example, who has been killed by a car crash. And yet, you know, so how do we build the constituency for that? I think we build the constituency for that by also tying it to other things that people who aren't necessarily affected by the problem get something from, if that makes sense. So like trying to create a sort of a way that multiple constituencies can win from the loss that comes from actually slowing speeds down in a community. Does that make sense?
Great. Well, I think it's a really interesting set of comments taken together. So I think what I heard is really the importance of the design standards, and that there has to be an acknowledgement, I think, to use Offer's words, that the kinetic energy carried on a system needs to align with the design of the system, and an acknowledgement that at least on high-speed multimodal arterials right now, in many parts of at least the American context, they don't. But you've laid out how other design standards, particularly separation, could get over that. Or I think Chris also used the term low-hanging fruit, that even narrowing of lane widths, while not fully addressing the sort of mismatch between the kinetic energy on the system and the risk to the users, at least moves maybe the needle in the correct direction. So I think I hear from Nat the real role of these macro level policy that have to do with design standards, but what Rebecca's getting at is how change comes in that world, and it can come through these pilots that then may ripple up actually towards changing the standards. So I think it's very helpful to hear that from the panel. I want to turn now, we have a question from Wes Comfort in the question and answer. And he asks, could the panel speak to two common responses you'll often see to this kinetic energy concept? The first is that impact speed is lower than operating speed, so we need to use impact speed in our kinetic energy management techniques rather than operating speeds. And the second part of his question is, are speed differentials as problematic as high speeds? So maybe we'll start with you, Offer, on this one, and then open it up to everybody else. Does that okay?
Sure. So thank you for the question, Wes. So the first part of the question, I just want to repeat to make sure I got it right, is whether stating that impact speed is lower than operating speed. So that is actually the speed or the amount of kinetic energy at impact is what we care about more than the amount of kinetic energy that's being carried. And while I agree with that statement, that is essentially the problem that we want to solve. My a challenge with focusing on this is that that kinetic energy at impact is created by something going wrong, and we lack the ability to predict what will go wrong. So it's very hard to try and design a system that we know has flaws and to protect it from the situation where something goes wrong. That being said, I definitely think there's a lot of value to trying to protect for that, and more effort in vehicle design and multimodal crashes with vehicles hitting pedestrians, because that is essentially the kinetic energy that you have to contain when something does go wrong. And I want to add to that a little bit, and maybe it touches also the second part of the question, and that is kind of something that we learned from the pandemic. And typically what we measure in traffic or traffic safety is VMT. And maybe that also helps some of the policy discussions. And when the pandemic started, we all saw how the VMT dropped, and the expectations of many safety practitioners, including myself, was, oh, this is gonna reduce the number of fatalities. And what we saw is that that did not happen. Now, in retrospect, we all kind of are very smart to say, oh, if we actually look at the system, what happened is that the average amount of kinetic energy per trip actually went up because there was less traffic, less congestion. People on average were traveling at a higher speed. So the result is that the magnitude of the safety problem, thinking about this as the amount of kinetic energy that's being carried, actually went up. And that's indeed what happened. The number of fatalities has stayed the same, and in some states has even gone up. So it kind of tells us that measuring things that we're measuring now are good, like VMT, but if we don't also incorporate the things that we're talking about today, like kinetic energy, we are missing out on part of the mechanism. So Wes, to your question, the energy at impact is something that we want to focus on and study, but it's much harder. So I think as it's not a low-hanging fruit, but as an initial step, we want to first monitor the amount of kinetic energy that's carried, take it one step further, figure that out, and then figure out how we can also incorporate the kinetic energy at impact. And then the second part of the question was about speed differential versus high speed. So they're both bad. I don't. let me see if I can find the question. Oh, are speed differentials as problematic as high speeds? Well, at the end of the day, the high speed, as Chris said, that's the amount of kinetic energy that we have to manage. So that defines the scope of the problem, the magnitude more than anything else. Having high speed differentiation creates a situation that when something, it's more likely that mistakes will happen to some extent. And then when it does happen, it's much harder to balance. It creates an unbalanced situation. So in my mind, they're both super important, but at the end of the day, it's the high speed that defines how big of a problem you have at hand.
If I can chime in real quick, Noreen, to Offer's point about COVID was a nice natural experiment for us to see this kinetic energy in action. And when COVID started up, I was tracking fatalities and I was tracking injuries in Tennessee's database and trying to understand what was happening. And kind of remarkably, I thought the fatalities were not going down, but the total crashes and the severe injuries were going down. What that implies, of course, is, or I should say, total crashes and non-severe injuries. So what that implies, of course, and that trend is somewhat held true, is that the fatality rate is going up, and that's what's driving the increases. If the rising tide raised everything, then you'd see more crashes and everything else. But what we're finding is that the fatality rate is really driving things, and that we found that with our pedestrian work that we've done in Tennessee recently, and we're seeing that our spike in pedestrian fatalities is really correlated highly to the speed on which those fatalities are occurring. Not that there's just more pedestrians being hit all over every street. They're on these high kinetic energy streets. The critic of our work, of anybody's work in this area, would say, well, you don't know how fast the car was going when they hit the pedestrian or when they hit somebody else. But you can probably get a pretty strong correlation between the speed of impact and the speed limit of the roadway. And you can just see that it's the physics of it is demonstrated very clearly in the system, okay? And when we look at a crash that happens on a 45 mile per hour arterial, for example, in Tennessee, urban arterial, whether that crash occurred with an SUV or a sedan or something else, it's an extremely severe crash for a pedestrian. And those are the sorts of things that we need to untangle and really try to get at. The idea, though, that back to design and how people respond to the environment, COVID showed us, of course, that there were some media articles saying, street racers are causing all the problems. That's why. But I don't know if street racers can be responsible for the thousands or maybe tens of thousands of extra crashes you would suggest just by VMT alone. And so I believe that people are driving the roadways the way they were designed by engineers to be driven, which is we design them conservatively. I say this, I hate that word in design. We design them as 55 mile per hour roadways, because just like a steel bridge, we want to double everything and make sure that it lasts, right? But what we want people to do is respond by driving whatever speed limit we put up, 35 miles per hour. And the idea here is when we take away this unnatural, maybe this capacity valve, pressure valve, essentially, people drive just how we design the roads to be, okay, which is a lot more kinetic energy. So
to ask Chris one quick follow-up, one of the audience members asked if there was any place they could take a look at the work that you were citing around VMT and crashes, or if there's any place you might point them to on that.
Yeah, so there is some CSCRS work going on COVID and fatalities and crashes and crash rates. I know that, and that has not been published yet. I'm not on that team. I think Les might be on it, and I see he asked a question. But and then the pedestrian project is underway, so we have some preliminary results, but we'll have publications hopefully soon.
And Noreen, I could just respond to that. Actually, I mean, obviously Chris is doing work, but there is quite a bit of research showing that arterials are disproportionately dangerous for pedestrian fatalities. So we could send out, some resources after that. And there was just a study that I co-authored with Bob Schneider and Frank Prue and Hamida Moyed that was published in Journal of Transportation and Land Use, where we talked about, thank you, Kristen, pedestrian fatality hotspots being pretty much uniformly located along arterials in the United States.
Great. Well, thanks. Thanks to Kristen for following up with the link in the chat, and to all of you for providing some of the thoughts on where to look for future research that's going to be coming out on this. I wanted to sort of build upon this theme that we've been talking about here in this conversation about COVID and kinetic energy and what it can help us learn, both about the metrics that we should actually be looking at, i.e. beyond VMT, vehicle miles of travel, as Offer suggested, to actually be thinking about the kinetic energy on the roadway. But another big part of the COVID conversation has been the behavior change, right? I understand what Rebecca was saying about behavior change is difficult, but we did see a lot of behavior change, particularly about where people are working during COVID. And there's a very large discourse about how those changes will be cemented in the future. And I guess what I want to ask, and I'll start with Rebecca, is in some ways that's getting us towards a mode shift conversation. It's not about mode shift towards transit and walking and biking. It's mode shift towards maybe staying in our houses or eliminating the work trip. What does the experience during COVID or with other examples of mode shift tell us about how this conversation about network approaches to kinetic energy, and particularly the land use and planning part of it, could evolve? And so, Rebecca, I'll ask you first, like what you've been reflecting on as you've seen all these news reports and been doing your own work, and then we can open it up as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think had we had this discussion 6 months ago, my answer would have been different. So I was actually doing some research prior to the pandemic on teleworking, and then the pandemic happened and everything changed. And so I got to do a natural experiment there, in the beginning, I think we saw a lot of evidence. I mean, of course, people who could telework did. Let's recognize that those were disproportionately white collar workers, right? So there are a couple of things I want to hit on just so that I don't forget them. So number one is that like we saw it, teleworking was really disproportionately distributed throughout our economy. And we now have seen fairly recently that Black Americans, the percentage of, we've known for a while that Black Americans on a per capita basis are disproportionately killed, particularly when walking. So Black and Native American pedestrians are disproportionately killed on a per capita basis. And then through some recent research that Bob Schneider and I did, we also found that that does hold also when you look at National Household Travel Survey walking trips. But we saw that then increase last year. And I don't think we have the numbers yet to actually see like how that increase falls out between pedestrians, bicyclists, drivers, transit users, that kind of thing. But my hunch is that we're going to see some of that there. So we saw some benefits to the teleworking for, the white collar workers, and then our blue collar workers or our service workers who tend to be disproportionately lower income, and people of color actually didn't see those same benefits. And so I'm from a sort of planning policy perspective, I just want to center that like we cannot get away from all of the conversation we've just been having about how roadway design influences speed, because in as much as teleworking, made things sort of better or precipitated mode shift, it only did so for a privileged portion of our economy. So there's that. And then the second aspect of this is that actually what we're seeing through commercial real estate records, and I know this, some good friends who work in commercial real estate, and actually what we're seeing is that teleworking is probably not going to be maintained at the level we thought it would. So there was a point in the pandemic when all of the big firms, I mean, think about any big company, they were all saying, this is it, we're done, everybody's happy. And then that started to change. And part of what's happening there is that there were people who weren't as happy teleworking, particularly your younger workers who actually really rely on their colleagues for social networks, but also fields where you really need to be in-person training with someone. We know, I think we all know that we don't have the same kind of water cooler conversations. It's harder to just make this spontaneous, right? And so some of the disbenefits of teleworking actually started to become more evident the longer than it lasted. Even in my own research, what I heard from people was, I loved it at first, and after a while I grew lonely, tired, frustrated. I just want to be able to be in person with my colleagues again. So I just say that to say that I think the jury is really still out about how much teleworking is going to be part of this sort of longer term solution without some, without some way of still being in the office to still have those connections and create the camaraderie that's part of what makes so many jobs valuable. So I guess I'm giving you an I don't know. That's a bit of a long I don't know, but I do think that the evidence is really mixed there for how much that will influence our transportation patterns over the long term. The last thing I'll say is, in some other research that I'm doing right now, what I'm hearing is that driving levels are actually back up to pretty close to pre-pandemic levels in most places, or in many places, but it's not necessarily, like you said, it's not necessarily commute related. Or what's happened is that, people shifted from transit to driving. And so we thought there would be this shift, but because we had a big loss, transit took a big hit, it actually evened out. And so we're still back at the same sort of square one with, we have all of these cars and they want to be able to go where they want to be able, the drivers in them want to be able to go where they want to be able to go.
Yeah, I think the complexity of it is fascinating. I think as Chris and Offer were talking about, with the maybe unanticipated or unexpected safety impacts, but we've heard other folks talking about the potential for mode shift, whether it comes about through telework or increased shift to other modes. The hope, right, is that if you can get rid of the peak and the congestion associated with the peak, you could shift some of our limited transportation resources to other modes and not just funnel all of them to trying to deal with peak period congestion, which could, from an equity standpoint, be better. But what we're hearing from Chris's example is that getting rid of some of that congestion, which really slows down speed, was problematic from a safety perspective, right? And so these very nuanced balances are complicated. We've talked a lot about maybe, Offer, was that a hand raise?
Yes, just a very small follow-up comment about mode shift, which is a critical necessity, but also, as you indicated, it has to be coupled, or maybe it has to be coupled with more focused safety efforts to complement that. For example, if we're talking about mode shift to public transportation, we know the trip on the bus or on the train is relatively safe, but you have to make sure you're providing safe access to pedestrians and cyclists to those stations. So it's not necessarily mode shift is going to make it safer, or it will make it safer if you also are providing complementary better access for vulnerable road users. And then similarly, maybe regarding what Chris said about congestion, regarding congestion mitigation efforts, maybe that can also be coupled with safety efforts, because essentially you're now increasing the amount of kinetic energy of an average trip. So that needs to be coupled with a higher safety standard of the road. So what I think I'm saying is that whenever you're making desirable transportation improvements, you also need to use the safe system approach lens to make sure that there aren't any undesirable outcomes that are not the core of that effort, but can be indirectly related.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go to one of the audience questions because I think it follows on sort of this idea of complexity and unintended effects. So Victoria Barrett asks, regarding the kinetic energy issue, we're starting to think about the fact that electric vehicles are significantly heavier than gas-powered vehicles, making travel speeds and speed limit policies even more critical. Again, safer for people inside the vehicle and a threat to those outside the vehicle, like pedestrians and bicyclists. Does anyone on the panel, the question specifically asked, do you know of anyone doing research on this? But I would add to it, what are your thoughts about this topic? And I will start with Chris, because in your comment, you talk about vehicle design, and I think you said vehicle size matters, but it probably doesn't maybe matter as much as roadway design. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts about the electric vehicle issue with regard to weight specifically.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think it really matters if you get hit by a I'm going to say some names here, but I don't really know if it really matters that much, but a Tesla versus a Ford F-150, right? I think when you're thinking about a pedestrian, you're thinking about the kind of biomechanics of the crash, the part of the body that's hit and injured, and what happens to that pedestrian after they're struck. Do they get taken under the vehicle or do they go over the hood? Of course, the speed of the impact matters. You can do the analysis and say that if the average mass of our vehicles goes up by 10 or 15 or 20%, then we need to have a kinetic energy calculation to figure out what speed those vehicles should be going now in order to accommodate even a break-even safe level of safety for our existing roadways. And we've done some of that math, but remember, speed matters to the squared power. So it's really not that much of a, you can accommodate the increase in weight with just a few miles per hour lower speeds, operating speeds. And so it all goes back in my mind to that issue. And of course, city transit buses are like brick walls, right? They're perfectly vertical almost. Many of them have bike racks and other things that would be terrible to get hit by. But the point being is speed matters so much in those cases. And obviously mass is part of the equation. I'm a little bit more concerned, frankly, with heavier vehicles interacting with lighter vehicles from a pure imbalance occupant protection piece, because again, then the physics are transmitted to the occupants in very different ways than physically being struck by a vehicle. And there you have that imbalance that we've probably seen, it's well documented, or at least there's been a number of studies. There's one recently on the mass of a vehicle as it relates to pedestrian fatalities, but there's been others before that have looked at essentially the so-called arms race on the road. As vehicles get bigger and bigger, the mismatch causes more harm than good from an occupant perspective.
That's very helpful. Offer?
Thanks. And my response would be thanking Rebecca for kind of inspiring us to be visionary and kind of thinking bold and ahead, because when we think about different vehicles and different modes, I think at the extreme, we want to have the following state of mind, and that is that every entity that is operating on the roads needs to be able to carry the amount of protection to protect the occupants and non-occupants. If we take it like at the primal level, a pedestrian, if they fall, our body is usually fine. If you're a cyclist, you're wearing a helmet, there isn't quite protection if you're hitting a pedestrian. So we want to compliment for that. But if you're a vehicle, you need to carry the amount of protection for the occupants and for all of the non-occupants that you might interact with. Now, we know that we're not quite there yet, but in my mind, that is a good lens to think about regulating vehicle safety, and the gap between what we can achieve with vehicle design and what we actually need can be complemented with design and land use and many other things. But we want to encourage vehicle manufacturers to provide a higher safety standard if they are manufacturing heavier and or faster vehicles.
Great, good comments. I want to go to sort of move our conversation maybe from not quite to theory, but all of you work a lot with different agencies and with different communities. And what I'd like to do is ask you to let us know what examples do you think are really interesting for showing this promise of network level approaches? And some of it might be highlighting examples you've already given. Chris gave us the example of moving from 12-foot to 10-foot standards. So it could be small things. It could be one of these pilot projects that Rebecca highlighted with the New York City example. But I'm curious in thinking about designing the system based on the kinetic energy and not on VMT, what are the examples that are interesting or inspirational to you? Is there anybody that would like to go first?
I'll take the bait. I think just to reiterate Rebecca's point about interim design and so-called tactical urbanism approaches or something like along those lines. I think we had a big heavy road diet project. We'll call it road reconfiguration, whatever. That took a decade or more to build for a half a mile or 3/4 of a mile of roadway. It took that long because the state DOT didn't like the design standards, so they had to change over alternate routes and so on. The Federal Highway Administration didn't like the volume of vehicles that were operating on that roadway. It was too heavy of it sort of exceeded their road diet guidance from a VMT perspective, or ADT rather, perspective. And so in the end, it was a resounding safety success. The amount of safety improvements were remarkable. It was highly controversial among, the gas stations along the route. They wanted to keep all their driveways and everything else. But of course, it took political will to say, maybe we don't need 5 gas stations on this urban corridor, right? Half-mile long corridor. And eventually they built it with that political will, but they had to overcome a lot of difficulty. They made mistakes. For example, there's no accommodations for bicycles. And so the bike advocates are wagging their finger at the institutions. And some of those mistakes could have been alleviated through this incremental approach. Some of the testing and some of the education, I think that's a really important part as well, as the education part that we haven't really talked about yet, is just really letting people understand that, for example, I expect most of society doesn't realize that a 40-mile-per-hour street is more than twice as dangerous to everyone on the road than a 20-mile-per-hour street. They're giving up a lot more safety for twice the mobility, essentially. And so those are the sorts of educational things. And I think some of those are coming out. And I think that from a design perspective, there are institutions that basically run tactical urbanism shops out of their consultant groups or out of their own in-house groups. And you can just try things out of it. And I think the pandemic was a great example where a lot of people tried things, stuff didn't work. They swept it off the street and tried something else. We need more of that. And I think institutions can't, humans can't wait 10 years for a safety improvement on a corridor or a transit corridor or something else.
Great, thanks, Chris. Did anybody else want to share any additional examples? You've given a lot as we've been talking, but did anything spring to mind as you were thinking about this question?
So Noreen, Rebecca, go ahead.
Oh, just I three examples kind of are coming to mind, and I'll just say them briefly. And they're different examples. So one is, I can't remember if I said this earlier, but when London introduced congestion pricing years ago, they, it was hugely controversial, but they doubled the bus fleet overnight. And so it's an example of doing something that is really bold and visionary, but actually like really incorporating that sense, that balance for the need of the perceived loss with perceived gain, right? A few years ago, the city of Sevilla, Spain, basically built out in a very short period of time an entire network of protected bike lanes. So they didn't add them piecemeal, and that allowed people to go very quickly into having a full bike network. And we saw tremendous increase in ridership because of that. And I find both of those examples inspiring. In terms of a single corridor, this hasn't happened yet, but it's happening. 82nd Avenue, which is one of the most dangerous streets in Portland, and definitely on our high crash corridor, is an ODOT street, the Oregon Department of Transportation, and has just been sort of like a notorious offender for a really long time. And fairly recently, ODOT and the city of Portland, our Bureau of Transportation, PBOT, and then the state came together for an historic agreement to put in $185 million to transfer that street to the city of Portland and provide the upgrades needed. And there is the PBOT is centering racial equity, and so there is from the beginning this understanding that all of the improvements will be informed by the community. Obviously, transportation engineers and planners will be involved in this as well, and I'm really excited to see what comes of that street. So I would just put that out there as one for people to watch, that it has the potential to be really transformative, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that evolves.
Offer, are you good, or did you have something you wanted to share?
Very briefly. So in California, there's a lot of systemic work that is being done that then allows the agency to do more blanket system-wide improvements on a problem that has been identified in a specific type of design, and then make that improvement in other places. But when we're talking about actual implementations that agencies do, going to Sweden always provides a good inspiration. And what they did there, and it's also an opportunity to say that this is not just an urban problem, this is a rural problem. They systemically changed all of their 2-lane rural roads, 1 lane in each direction. They paved another lane, they made it 3 lanes, they call it 2+1 roads. But there's 2 lanes in one direction separated with a cable median, and every few miles it alternates. So the result is that for these rural roads where they had a lot of overtaking head-on collisions that are very deadly, they actually almost eliminated that by using safe system principles. People will make a mistake. The amount of kinetic energy needs not to be survivable, or can be unsurvivable. So building a design that eliminates or reduces both of these and then implementing it systemically is a really good example of how it's done in practice.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you for those examples. I think they capture the complicated dynamics of this, that we need the political will and support of the safe systems principles and a focus on kinetic energy, along with standards that support these type of implementations, along with the pilot projects, is small communities coming along and working on a specific intersection or a specific corridor to help all of us see what it might look in the places that we live. So we do, I know we're running out of time, and we do have a couple of questions, open questions. Rebecca, there was one question from Scott McConkey that Rebecca would like to respond to, and it was thinking about some of the dynamics around living and working in a rural population, and some of these issues that Offer was just mentioning in the Swedish context, the very high crash rate that they had experienced in their rural issues, and Scott is highlighting that with a specific example among high school students. And so Rebecca, can I turn it over to you to respond to Scott's question?
Yeah, and so I just want to start. I don't know if everyone saw Scott called me out for saying something that was dangerous, and I want to just apologize for what I said earlier about none of us know. That was, as it was coming out of my mouth, that was one of those things that sometimes when something's coming out of your mouth and you're like, oh, I'm on a live webinar, how do I don't know whether or not any of you know that. So I apologize for saying that. I have no idea what you all have experienced personally about traffic crashes. And I agree with Scott, and I appreciate you calling me out on that, that it's a dangerous assumption to make. I can only speak from my experience. What I will say where that was coming from is that I've been doing a lot of talking because I study crashes pretty much all day, every day. It's something I care about quite a bit, even though my family personally hasn't been affected by this. And I ask people in my everyday life all the time about what they know about traffic crashes in the United States. And if they aren't in transportation, they basically know nothing unless they have experienced it personally. So that's where that was coming from. But I agree with you, as an insensitive statement, and I apologize for that. Where my heart is that I don't think Americans take this crisis seriously. If we think about the fact that tens of thousands of people die every year and hundreds of thousands are injured, and we don't even have really good numbers on that. It is a public health crisis, and it has been for decades, and we just live with it as if it's no big deal. And I'm struggling with this personally because, as I said, I'm actually polling really thoughtful, caring, community engaged people in my life in various aspects, and none of them know anything about it. And so I am as a professional thinking about what my role is and what our profession's role is to actually center this much more in our transportation policy. And so Offer gave some good examples of, finally we have a resolution that's being put forward towards zero deaths. But I think we have a long way to go. So you are absolutely right that that was not a good statement. I apologize. And I also appreciate you bringing the rural perspective in here. I do think that there are folks who focus on rural traffic safety, and then there are folks who focus more on urban traffic safety, and we need to be talking more, and they're both incredibly important. And a fatality is a tragedy, whether or not it occurs in an urban or a rural area. I think the solutions are often different, just based on what's feasible in certain areas in terms of the roadway width and policy and that kind of thing, but they are both important. So I just wanted to acknowledge Scott's comment and apologize for that. I don't know if anyone has more technical response to rural crashes, but I just wanted to give a personal response.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. And Scott also placed his own response in the Q&A dialogue. So thank you, Scott, for doing that. We are almost out of time, so I am actually going to end things here, and I want to take a little bit of time to just reflect on what we've heard. You'll see a slide up that Kristen is sharing about some of the upcoming sessions, so take a look at that. But I think we really heard, and actually Rebecca's last comments and Scott's comments made me think about some of the power of this network level approaches to kinetic energy is that it does give us an approach and a language that can apply across these different contexts, even if some of our solutions from a design standpoint might be different. If we're focused on kinetic energy, we're going to see those problems in urban areas, see the problems in suburban areas, and see the problems in rural areas, and come up with solutions that work there. So we need the policy recognition at the highest levels, but then we need these creative examples from across the world, really. You heard examples from across the world, but also from contexts that are similar to the places we live, so that we can have faith that if we make change in our own communities, it will move forward in a positive direction. So I want to wrap up first by giving a huge thank you to our panelists. This was such a fascinating conversation. Really, the level of expertise here and the drawing together, I think, of the engineering and the planning perspectives was really rich, and I'm excited to go back and work more on these issues. I also want to thank everybody who's on the webinar. Thank you so much. Friday afternoon during the summer. This shows the power, I think, of this session, that we have so many people on and we had such a rich dialogue. So thank you again, and a huge thank you to CSCRS and its director, Laura Sant, for organizing such an invigorating series for all of us during this summer. So thanks again.